Hello everyone and welcome to the session of Winter of Code by DSC IIIT Kalyani. Today we have an amazing person joining us who is currently the Senior Product Manager of Flutter at Google. So without further ado, let me welcome Chris Sales on the stage.
Hi,
Hi Chris.
how are you?
Yeah, I'm great. How are you?
I'm good.
Yeah, nice.
It's early morning here, but my guess is it's pretty late there.
Yeah, okay. So as you all might know, this will be a Flutter Q&A session. And I would be asking you, Chris, some questions given by the audience. So before diving into the questions, first of all, I would like you to introduce yourself a bit and what's your role in the Flutter team at Google?
Certainly. So I am one of the product managers on the Flutter team. My primary responsibility is managing the end-to-end developer experience for Flutter developers. So I work a lot with our tooling engineers and I work with our framework engineers to make sure we have a smooth developer experience. I also work with the desktop platforms, making sure they're in good shape and working them up from preview through alpha to beta, etc. And I also work with our top partners and customers.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, so uh, I think you also worked on different frameworks and tools before coming to the Flutter team.
Yes, I did. I have had about a 30-year career in the IT industry. I've worked for Intel, I've worked for Microsoft. Of course, I've been here at Google for 6 years. Before coming to Google, I was about 20 years in as a contributing member of the Windows developer community, including 8 years at Microsoft. And I have worked with um, uh, MFC, Visual Basic, the component object model. I've worked with ATL and STL. I've worked with WinForms and WPF. And I've worked with a lot of the HTML toolkits and frameworks as well. So, and also uh, I was part of the PM team that defined the development model for Windows 8, which ultimately became uh, Universal Windows Programming, UWP.
Oh, that's amazing. So, like before coming to the product management side, like you said, you were also a software engineer before. So,
Yes, I came to the PM side through the engineering path. I started, I have a bachelor's and master's in computer science. And I was a software engineer for many years. I've been, technical support. I've done software engineering. I've done installations at customer sites, written documentation, testing. I've been a chief architect. I've been a consulting engineer. I have done pretty much all the engineering things in the software world.
oh, that's amazing. Like you have almost all the roles possible before this coming to the product management.
I and more recently, even VP of engineering and chief technical officer for
Oh,
a small startup for a short period. So, yeah, I've been very lucky in my career. I've gotten do a lot of things.
oh, that's great. So, was there any specific reason for shifting to the product management side from the engineering roles? And was it a quite different role in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry about that. Um, Actually, it was an accident. I kind of stepped into the PM role accidentally. When I went to work at Microsoft, I came on board as a content strategist. It was my job to pull together a bunch of content for various parts of Windows Longhorn, which is what we called it at the time. Ultimately, it shipped as Windows Vista. There's a number of technologies, including the Windows Presentation Foundation, WPF, that it was my job to pull content together for, build up a website, build up a community so that developers who wanted to program against these features in Windows Vista had all the information that they needed. And at Microsoft, they didn't have a content strategist position that was fairly specialized. So I came on board as a PM, and that is a program manager. And at Microsoft, PMs can mean practically anything, right? You think of PMs as the peanut butter that fills all the cracks, right? All the stuff that needs doing that engineers and testers don't do, then that's what PMs do. And so it was kind of a catch-all. And so that was my title. But with that title, coming in as a PM, eventually I moved on to a different role at Microsoft, and my title was PM. So I was hired at another team as a PM. And when I started as a PM, both my boss and I were very surprised to know that I had no idea how to be a PM. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know the tasks. I didn't know my job or my role. I had no formal training of any kind. And so instead of firing me on the spot, which he certainly could have done, instead what he did was a lot of on-the-job training. And that's how I learned to be a program manager at Microsoft. And after about 6 years doing it there, I've done it in various other capacities since then. Always very technical, always very engineering focused, always focused. Almost my entire career has been focused on developer tools and services. And that's my passion. Those are my people. So I've been doing PMing along those lines ever since then.
Okay, that's amazing to listen to a journey. Yeah, so let's now dive into the Flutter questions that we have collected from the audience. So first of all, how would you like to describe Flutter in 2 words?
In 2 words, 2 words. If I were to use 2 words, one of them is going to be hyphenated. I'll say multi-platform toolkit.
Okay, that's a great start. Okay, so moving on to the next question. So Flutter on its official website is described as Google's UI toolkit for beautiful natively compiled applications for mobile, web, and desktop from a single code base. But during the last official Flutter event, which was back in 2019, the Flutter Interact, during the start of that event, Flutter was defined as a portable UI framework for an ambient computing world. So do you have anything to add to as why a different tagline was used during the Flutter Interact event?
Sure. So Flutter is the fundamental goal of Flutter is pretty much anywhere that there's a place that needs pixels moved to interact with users. That's where we want Flutter to be. Now, when the long history of Flutter includes first this idea of a underlying engine and then a set of widgets built on top of that engine. It's a low-level, high-performance engine that accesses the GPU on the low end, and then a set of user-friendly widgets to write efficient programs against that engine. When we started, we needed to be able to get it into people's hands, and so we started with Android and iOS. Right, there was already a proven need there. People were struggling with how do they have high productivity from a developer point of view, but also native speeds when it comes to user point of view. And lots of toolkits provide one or the other, but Flutter aims to be the sweet spot for both. And so we needed to package it up and try it and get it into people's hands. And we started with iOS and Flutter. And after that, Of course, there is a huge long tail of devices, everything from, laptops and phones and tablets, all the way through, refrigerators and microwaves and Raspberry Pi and embedded devices and Arduinos and industrial equipment, all of this long tail of devices that need UI. I mean, you look anywhere these days and you're interacting with some set of pixels on some kind of screen. And so, Flutter aims to be useful in all those places. Now, the Flutter team itself is focused on 6 platforms, 2 mobile, web, and 3 desktop platforms, with the idea that is the biggest impact we can have with the smallest number of platforms, right? That represents a huge number of developers and devices. But we also work with customers, and we've done prototyping ourselves for Flutter running on other devices. For example, there's a reference implementation of Flutter on Raspberry Pi that one of the Flutter team did on their own. And then like I say, I work with customers that think about Flutter on all kinds of other devices. And so when we look at that, the work that the Flutter team itself is doing is focused on those 6 platforms, but we work with customers and people are taking it into all kinds of places. And our ultimate goal is to get it everywhere, for it to be, part of our ambient computing environment.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. Okay, so as you know, most of our audiences are university students, and there are a lot of them who are afraid of writing tests. So I think, as you said, you have some experience of writing tests before. So, like the university students, they take the tests very lightly and prefer to skip them most of the time. So, as a professional Flutter developer, would you like to have your opinion regarding this testing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not actually a professional Flutter developer. There are a lot of independent consultants and consulting firms and employees at companies that write Flutter programs all day, every day. That's not my job. My job is to make sure that those professional Flutter developers have a good experience. However, I am an amateur Flutter developer, evenings and weekends for fun and to help me do my job better. I do write Flutter code. Over the holiday break, I wrote a little scalable backgammon game, right? So it takes up however much space you've got on the screen, and it does animations as you move the pieces around, and it tries to implement all of the backgammon rules, which turns out to be kind of difficult actually in some cases. And so, that's one of many projects that I've done, but I try to build real world things so that I can put myself into the shoes of professional Flutter developers. And I have to say, I'm a big fan of test-driven development. When it comes to all aspects of professional development, you're making assumptions as you write your code, and you can capture a lot of those assumptions in asserts, and I'm very heavily assert based. I try to do a lot of that to make sure that I'm right about my assumptions when I'm writing my algorithms. But you're also looking for specific results out of your algorithms, whether it's how you're drawing things on the screen, or implementing backgammon rules, or et cetera. And so I never have any confidence that what I've done is correct across the board until I've got significant test coverage. I really need to, for my own peace of mind and confidence, write those tests. And the way I do it is I write the test first. I write a lot of unit tests. Often I have as many lines of code in my unit tests as I do, in the algorithms that I'm testing.
Yeah.
And in fact, in this last round of unit tests, of course, I have an internal data structure in my little backgammon game. This is just top of mind for me, so that's how I'm thinking about it. In my little backgammon game, I have an internal data structure, which holds all the pieces, etc. but it's hard to visualize that when you're writing your test, right? Here's an instance of that data structure, now do something to it. It's hard to really think about, where the pieces are on the board. So what I did was I actually write my tests that's describe the board. I have little ASCII art with little X's and O's on the various pips and a little board. And if I look at my test, I can say, okay, this is what the board looks like, just as if it was a backgammon board. And then I wrote code that would parse that little ASCII art to actually create the data structure. And so when I write my test, it's easier for me to say, okay, here's the state of the board. Now here's the moves. Are those legal moves? Or here's the state of the board. Here are the dice rolls. What are the list of legal moves? Here's what I expect, etc. I take the testing very, very seriously, and I don't really have much confidence in any code that doesn't do the same thing. So I very much recommend thinking about, especially when you're writing your algorithms, because unit testing is so easy and so quick. And Dart has such a great unit testing framework, especially when you do that. If you're not writing the test first, how do you even know what you want out of your code? How do you even know what you expect and whether you got what you expected? So big fan of tests.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so moving on to the next question. So you were part of the Android team at Google before joining the Flutter team, am I correct?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so I think this question, you would like to take this question. If we compare Dart and Kotlin as languages, is there any feature you would like to be incorporated to Dart from the latter or vice versa?
Me personally, yes, I would love to have data objects. Kotlin data objects are really great to be able to just say, hey, I want to capture this data. And then once I've captured, in a type, and then, at runtime, when I capture that, it's immutable. And then, have all of the stuff just implemented for me, like equals and, hash and to string and, copy and all of those things that Kotlin just does behind the scenes for you with a little bit of code. I would really love to have in Flutter.
Yeah, I think that answers the question. We have one more question related to testing. How does the testing framework of Flutter compare with that of native coming from an Android background?
So it's pretty similar. I mean, there's two kinds of testing frameworks that you typically do, broadly speaking. One tends to be unit testing, right? These tend to be non-UI tests where you're testing your underlying algorithms. And most test frameworks are the same there in the sense that there's some setup, to get the data the way you want it to start, and then some actions that you do against that data and those algorithms, and then what your expected values. And the way you write that in pretty much any test framework is the same. I happen to really like the way the Dart unit testing framework is structured, and I think it's easier to use and has less ceremony than a lot of them. But it's pretty much the same. And GUI testing, integration testing, is meant to kind of simulate a user, right? You start up your app, you put it into a certain state, it's got a certain GUI, and then the system will look at that GUI and try to find elements. Hey, there's a button, there's a text field, there's a tab, control, whatever, and then do actions against that, and then check that the output is what you expect. So broadly speaking, they're both the same kinds of things, right? You set something up ahead of time, you do some actions, you check for output. And that's the same no matter what framework you're using. The syntax turns out to be different, of course, because you're writing it in Dart, and there's an API for doing it in Dart that's different than doing it in Android or iOS or other frameworks. But fundamentally, it's all really the same kind of thing.
Yeah. So it differs only in the syntax, but the whole process remains the same.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have one question related to augmented reality. Is it possible to build apps having AR support in Flutter?
Well, that's a good question because, fundamentally, we want Flutter pixels everywhere, right? So the barrier there is not, can you write, augmented reality, right? Can you, have some device that, shows Flutter pixels, or, can you write a Flutter program that shows kinds of the augmented reality data? The answer is absolutely yes. The question is, is there any hardware that allows you in an AR environment to run Flutter? And we have been doing some experimenting with UWP and generating UWP binaries, which we have experimented with running on Xbox, and that works. We know that our experimental bits run on Xbox. Theoretically, those same bits would run on the HoloLens, although I know of no one who's actually tested it. But maybe if you have some enterprising students in the audience that would like to use our experimental bits, we haven't really packaged them very well. They're in the repo, such as they are right now. But we plan on getting those packaged up in experimental form, where we can put them into user hands in the future. And at that point, you could experiment if you wanted with the HoloLens. In terms of other devices, other augmented reality devices, we don't support any of them right now. That's kind of, all of those are kind of, developing right now. But it is my fondest hope that you absolutely will be able to write a Flutter program that, causes augmented reality bits to happen. I definitely want, the Terminator style heads-up display as I wander around the world. And I would like nothing more than for that to be written in Flutter.
Okay. Actually, I am personally looking forward to AR support in Flutter.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is about state management. What's the preferred state management approach for a beginner? Rather, do beginners really need to worry about state management?
Yeah, so for this has been a question for a while now, and at I/O a year and a half back, Google's I/O conference, we kind of declared one of the community-built state management solutions as the one that we recommend for most people, and that the name of that is the provider package. And that's built by a community member in conjunction with some initial feedback from Google. And in fact, we had our own that we were kind of building up to be official as what we recommend for beginners. And we dropped it and just worked with Remy on his provider package. So we definitely recommend provider for beginners. And the reason we recommend it is it has a good mix of easy to use API, easy to get started, easy to understand, but it also, over time, as your program gets more and more complicated, it scales nicely to do the kinds of things that you're likely to do in most programs. Now, if there is some reason, maybe you're familiar with hooks, maybe you're familiar with Redux, maybe you're familiar with MobX from other platforms. We have implementations of those in Flutter as well. So if you're familiar with those, feel free to use those. But all other things being equal, if you don't have experience or with something else that you'd really just like to use, and you're just kind of starting from scratch, we definitely recommend provider.
Okay, so provider is the way to go for the beginners. So is there any chance that there is an official Flutter support for Apple Watch and Wear OS devices?
That's a good question. Turns out that most watches these days are still very, very low resources, and we have trimmed Flutter down very far. So you can reasonably run it on, small devices like Raspberry Pis and things like that. But even so, most watches have resource constraints such that Flutter is can be made to run on them. This is not something we support because it's not a great experience. And our goal, first and foremost, is for any platform that we support, it ultimately we want it to be a great experience for the developer and for the user. And we haven't yet cracked that nut for Flutter on those tiny devices, which represent watches.
Okay. Recently, DartFFA got a number of updates, and it is currently in beta, I guess.
That's correct.
Yeah, the question is that I need DartFFA in order to integrate a C library, which I have already built to interact with the Flutter app, but found that the examples on the documentation are a bit intimidating and lacking in something in a way.
That's not a question, that's a complaint, but it's a good one, and it's one that we like. Please, if those are a great opportunity to log bugs and issues. It turns out that documentation things can be fixed a lot faster than underlying code things. So if you have specific places where you're trying to use the docs and it doesn't make sense, you don't have examples, you don't have the right tutorials you're looking for, those are all great opportunities for logging issues on GitHub, and then those are things that our docs team can tackle.
Yeah, okay. Dart NullSafety is in beta, as we know, and many of the package developers are already started migrating their code to NullSafety. So when should app developers start to worry about the migration to NullSafety?
Good question. As of right now, the student who asked that question did a good job. We're in beta, and it is the time for package authors to pay attention to it. They should be busy porting to NullSafety. They should be publishing as pre-release on PubDev so that you can access those and test them. But really, for app developers, we don't expect them to take advantage of NullSafety until NullSafety moves into stable. And at that point, because we've already started working with authors on the migration, at that point, the idea is that we can have most of the popular packages ready for developers, because we recommend app developers don't move until their underlying packages that they're depending on have moved. It just gives them a much better experience, and it gives them the full NullSafety soundness that we're hoping that they'll get. Turns out that we've got 15,000 plus Flutter compatible packages and plugins, and not all of them are going to be available at the stable release of NullSafety, obviously. In fact, some of them will never be moved. But that's okay, because it turns out that with some tiny percentage of packages, we hit like 80% of the use cases in terms of what people actually use day to day. The long tail will take longer, but we're hoping to get that initial small percentage ported as fast as we can, and very close to a stable release of NullSafety.
Okay, that answers that. Currently, Flutter developers can also use their code written for mobile devices directly on web with very minimal changes. But when compared to the native web app, it certainly lacks in the performance. So can we expect any major performance improvement in the stable release of Flutter Web?
That's a good question. As of right now, I told you over the holidays, I was building my little backgammon program. And I noticed quite a difference in performance myself by default out of the box when I was generating, just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, especially when it came to the animations. However, I flipped the flag to use the underlying Canvas kit implementation. We actually support generating two kinds of outputs for Flutter Web, and one uses just HTML and CSS and JavaScript. The other is built on something called Canvas Kit, which essentially does everything that Flutter does inside of a Canvas element in HTML. And that gives us quite a bit more performance. In fact, once I'd moved over to using Canvas Kit for my little test program, I had performance that was identical to desktop, as far as I could tell. So I definitely recommend looking into using Canvas Kit, and you can find in the Flutter Wiki instructions on how to do so, but I think you'll find performance is considerably better. Now, right now, web's in beta. Beta means, hey, we've implemented what we plan on implementing for an initial stable release, and we're doing a lot of bug fixing, and we're doing a lot of performance improvements. So I would look for a great deal of performance improvement between beta, where we are now, and stable, which is when we think it's ready for production use.
Okay, that was amazing to hear that we're getting such performance improvement in Flutter Web. Okay, we have just a few questions left. So before moving on to them, I have one question that I am also eager to ask.
Okay.
So yeah, we all know that there is one grand Flutter event which is scheduled for March, and people are really curious to know what's coming up on it. So do you want to share anything that we should definitely look forward to, any kind of teaser or insider news maybe?
So if I were to answer that question, then you would be very disappointed when March 3rd came along, and you already knew the things that were going to happen. So here's what I will say instead. What I will say is we are coordinating that event with a new stable release of Flutter, as we often do with our events. And we're working hard to make sure that's a great stable release, and we plan on having some pretty great things to announce. And I think some of them are going to be quite surprising and hopefully delightful when you see them. So look forward to that event on March 3rd.
Okay, that's great. I am also not looking to any spoilers, that's why.
No
That's great also.
spoilers.
Yeah. Okay, so next question is there any chance of announcement of a Flutter certification? Like we have for Android, that is Android Associate Android Developer Certification, and in some other domains like in Google Cloud, that is Google Cloud Professional Certification, TensorFlow Certification. Can we expect something like that coming to Flutter?
I imagine we will have some sort of Flutter certification over time. Right now, we're hearing from certain developers in certain regions around the world. Certifications are very important. In other regions, it's not important at all. But from those regions, we hear that question on a pretty regular basis. But what we don't hear is a lot of employers come to us and say, hey, we have a very uneven Flutter developer pool. Is there something Google could do from a certification point of view? So we have developers asking, but not employers. And until there's demand from both sides, it doesn't really help anyone to have certifications. And so I imagine we will in the fullness of time, right? Flutter, as it, of course, Android and those other technologies in the first, few years of their lifetime, as they were still growing and changing rapidly, like Flutter is now, there weren't any certification programs. So when we get to a level of maturity of both Flutter itself and the Flutter ecosystem and the economy, essentially, that is built up around Flutter, then I assume we will absolutely have certification programs.
Okay. But the last question is about internships and job opportunities at Google. Uh, Is it only through traditional interview process, or can someone be considered based upon their community contribution and their grab on a certain technology as well?
We have a number of programs where community contributions help. Certainly, internships are one of those, and in general, employment at Google, right? If you show passion and excitement and enthusiasm and experience with a certain technology, and the team is hiring, they're going to first look at people that are well known in the community and pick those folks. So that always helps when you're getting hired at Google or anywhere, right? If you're somebody that's well known in the community for whatever the technology is, you're going to have a leg up. So I definitely recommend if you're a Flutter lover, to get involved in the community. There are other programs we do as well besides full-time employment and internships at Google. There's our Google Developer Experts, where if you give a certain number of talks and you make a certain number of community presentations and you get yourself a certain reputation in the community as being good, as a speaker and as a blog author and as a contributor to the community, then you can be considered for as a Flutter developer expert. And that also, by the way, being a GDE, also looks great on a resume when you're applying at Google or anywhere, right, for a Flutter job. So definitely, there are programs to dig into, and community contributions are always a good way to distinguish yourself, on the pile of resumes when you're looking for a job. Certainly, the my blog and the books I wrote have helped me get jobs. A long time ago, when I was writing my first book, a friend of mine, Dan Weston, told me that a book is a 600-page resume, and in general, any contribution you make to the community that you're excited about always looks good on a resume and helps land a job.
Yeah, okay. That's great to hear. Like all of my folks were asking like to ask this question to you, and that's an amazing answer. Like there is a lot of opportunity and community contribution always helps in that.
Yes.
Okay, so with that, we have come to the end of the questions. So thank you for joining us, Chris, and it was amazing to talk to you. And
it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
yeah, great. We are looking forward to have you again in our event.
Certainly. Happy to.
Yeah, great. So we are wrapping the event today. Thank you for joining everyone and hope to see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.